And we are live. Great. So hello to everyone watching on Facebook. We were just chatting away in the background, but welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to talk a bit about how to keep you connected, organised and calm over the next few weeks of exams. So if you were with us last week for our webinar, welcome back and thanks for joining us again today. You're probably familiar with our faces, but for those who are just tuning in for this week, my name is Kelly and I'm one of the counsellors here at the Uni Counselling Service. I am joined today by three wonderful people who have kindly given up their time to speak with you. So just let me quickly introduce them. So starting with my wonderful colleague, Nicola, who is also a counsellor here at the uni. And Nicola will help us through the tips today and talk us through some of the challenges that you might face as well. And to help her out with that are two of our wonderful students, Caitlin and Christian, who were also with us last week. And they're going to share their thoughts and experiences with you today from their own study journeys. So thank you all for your time and welcome.
Thank you.
And just before we move on today, we would just like to recognise and acknowledge that we are on Kaurna land today. And we recognise the Kaurna people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So a few weeks ago now, some of you may recall receiving some tips through my uni about exams. The info was grouped into 4 themes: staying connected, well-timed, organised and calm. So as we did with last week's webinar, our tips today will revolve around those 4 themes. You won't be able to see this on Facebook, but we had popped a poll up for some of our people who are registered through Zoom, and we just asked what is causing the most stress at the moment. And the answers for that were worried about sitting the exam at home, exam timing, what to do if I panic, and what if technology fails. And there are a few answers that were quite close, and the top 2 were what if technology fails, worried about sitting at home. So given these concerns and these causes of stresses, I might hand it over to you now, Nicola, to talk us through what students might be able to do to help themselves through over the next few weeks.
Thank you, Kelly. We'll get started. Like Kelly said, we'll go through the 4 kind of themes. So if we get started on well connected, we'll just bring up the slides. That's okay. No. It's funny, well connected, when I started thinking about it, actually made me think about socializing and being with friends. But I suppose when it comes to exams, particularly to online exams, there are some really useful things that we might be able to do in advance that can reduce the kind of additional stress on exam days. So if we just have a look through, there are those 4 points there. Some of these things are probably quite obvious, but I think when we're stressed, it's actually the obvious things that we often forget. So Christian, have you had to work out any of these connection issues as part of your exam prep, or have you got any tips that you might want to share with the people that are watching?
Yeah, of course. So I really like, you said that they're obvious, and, some of these are really obvious, but they're ultimately still really, really important. And I think here for these 4 tips, they shouldn't really be thought of as independent from one another. Like, the way I would view it is, think of it as more of a process, go through these tips one by one. For example, my first online exam on Monday, when I first read these tips a few days out, I really tried to put them, take them to heart and put them into a process where I could use to cover my bases. I think a good thing to have in mind here is Murphy's Law. Whatever can go wrong will go wrong. And unfortunately, with computers and online exams, there's so much that can potentially go wrong. We really have to remember to put in, 30 minutes, a few days out, just to make sure, simple things like, what the exam portal is, make sure that your computer's working, there's no real glaring issues. If there is, jump on that now before everyone else does on the day, and floods that support line. Be really proactive with it.
Absolutely. And I mean, if we flip back to the slides and go into the block section as we did last week, the blocks that you can see, they summarize actually what you're talking about. Things like, I'll check that stuff tomorrow, and actually doing it now might be really useful. If we just flick onto the boosters page, so there are some kind of tips there. Christian, are there any of these that you might have used, or any extra tips that you might want to put into this boosters section?
Yeah, so number 4, that exam hotline. I've got a massive post-it note right next to my monitor with that written in huge bold letters. So if any time I need it, it's right there. But also personally, like the first one about being proactive and checking internet options. So I've got a close study friend, and we've got an agreement with each other that if we have any issues with computers or the internet, one day out or on the day, we've sort of agreed that we can go around to each other's houses to make use of internet or a spare computer. And it's not an ideal situation, because there's meant to be that separation because of exam conditions. But in my mind, it's better than not being able to access the exam and taking part at all.
Absolutely, great tips there. So let's flick on to well-timed. So tips for keeping on top of time during the exam. Looking at number 2, I mean, as psychologists and counsellors, we talk a lot about breathing and how to make use of it to calm anxiety. So it seems kind of counterintuitive when you think of being in an exam, a kind of time-pressured situation. But if we take a moment to catch our breath, it can really help to reduce anxiety enough to then make use of some of the other tips that you might see outlined. Caitlin, are there kind of particular tips that you have relied on when it comes to managing exam anxiety, kind of around timing?
For me, I think when it comes to well-timed, in my experience, I think, I suppose, for instance, I suppose more practical tips that I have used while in an exam, first, obviously, you have to understand the reason you've introduced breathing techniques is because, panic overrides those cognitive functioning abilities to be able to think, even if you know that answer, which is really frustrating. And I do bring that up a little bit later with panic as well.
Sure.
But, I think sort of, for instance, I think if you're going to be well-timed, you sort of like, you're actually in the exam, some of the practical ways of looking at it is sort of maybe focusing on some of the questions that are sort of maybe like maybe worth more than some of maybe the smaller parts. So like go straight to those sections, because I find that what happens is if you start from the beginning sometimes and you get to the end, you're rushing through like, these 40% or these really large percentages of sort of your exams. And so, if you sort of just go through, have a look at some of maybe like sort of the actual exam, like what it looks like while you're sitting there in the exam room, and see what is more important in regards to that. Go for that first. And that's kind of like a working your way backwards type of way that I utilized, so that it wouldn't be like I'd be doing some, like, for instance, like multiple choice straight up, and then, I've run out of time, and then I see that the last section's all these, I suppose like short essay questions, and they're worth, a ton more. And I'm like, scrambling and panicking. I find that if I've been able to do that first section first, that are larger points, and then go and do some of the lighter stuff, I sort of lower their panic anxiety, because I'm like, sweet, I've done the larger parts first. I've made the best quality of the work there, because as we all know, as time starts to get closer to the end of the exam clock, you start to freak and panic, and you're just like racing through it. So that's sort of what I use in a sort of a backwards technique, which to me was just so helpful, because I knew, okay, once I had that section done, it was just a matter of just, going through what I knew, what I didn't know. And, sometimes, if you don't know the answer, just give it a whirl. That's the thing that I do. Maybe you might get a lucky guess, and other things, maybe you might, something new. So it's sometimes little things like that just takes the pressure off, so that you're not having to panic as much. It takes the anxiety away. You feel like at the end of the exam, you're not rushing to do these huge essays. You have that set and done, and you're happy with the quality. And from there, I think that's, you're not at the end of an exam freaking out, which is something that happens on the regular with many, many students.
Absolutely. Just to pick up actually on one of the things you mentioned, and it leads us into the blocks. because one, you know, primary block is this idea of the faster that I get started, the more I can cram in. And that's kind of what you're talking about, actually pausing to, you know, plan out where can you most usefully direct your attention.
Where are your strengths? Looking at where your strengths are, looking at the strengths of the actual exam itself, you know, in front of you. And
if we flick onto the boosters, you know, that might kind of also inform some of these tips that you're given.
And so, you know, I just find out that pretty much that I was able to feel like once I had done the sections that were worth the most, the panic was alleviated quite a lot, and then I could sort of progress towards the end of the exam without this countdown clock panic that comes along with exam processes. So,
and I can see you nodding away as well as Caitlin's talking, that it sounds like you kind of have found those tips helpful as well in the past.
Me or Christian?
all of us.
We've all done exams. I was nodding as well. Sorry, Christian.
It cuts across like gender, race, culture, you know, class. I think everyone feels that. It's, you know, it's so important, these boosters, and what Caitlin's saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's move then from time into being well organised. So being well organised, it's clearly a skill. And whether it comes naturally to us or not, there's some really good tips that can kind of help us to set up an exam space that gives us the best chance of demonstrating what we know, rather than kind of getting caught up. Caitlin, as you were talking about. Now, this semester, devices are going to be a much more integral part to the exam process than they probably ever have been previously. So things like charging devices, again, this idea that they're obvious things, but when we're stressed or when we're really focused on the content of what we're trying to learn, we can forget this kind of stuff. Christian, is being well organised, does that come naturally to you? Are there things that you kind of do at exam time that are helpful to let us know about?
A little bit naturally, but I find it's like any sort of skill. You can develop it and you can get better and better at it as you go, and you focus on it more. I think tip number one is really great one, and is really under exaggerated. And personally, during, you know, coronavirus, while everyone's been at home and, you know, we've been away from the uni, we've sort of had to focus on staying at home. This is something I've been really trying to put into practice. So, you know, every day I'll try to get up at the same time, shower, get dressed, sort of in the idea that, you know, I'm going out to uni or I'm going to work, and then I just sit down at my desk and I study. And I find that doing this, it really helps me get into the frame of mind where I'm really ready to do work, and it helps me avoid that trap of seeing my home as, you know, the space for relaxation and getting distracted. You know, so going on to exams with this is that if you start doing this, like, you know, even a few days out from exams, that habitual sort of preparation really helps, because, you know, you'll get used to this. And so, you know, the day of the exam, you wake up and you won't really have to do anything different than what you've been doing. You know, you won't feel like you're overwhelmed. You're like, oh, I've got to get up, you know, I've got to shower, I've got to eat. Oh, the exam's starting in 40 minutes. It'll be so normal that it's about minimizing those sources of stress, as I feel.
Absolutely. And, you know, I suppose like any tips that are, we often know a lot of the things that we can do to help us, but when we get put under stress or we're put under pressure, then we can either forget about them, or there can be some blocks that kind of come up, so some common thoughts that get in the way. And when it comes to being organised, I mean, I think the blocks that we've spoken about are things like, you know, I don't have a good relationship with my housemates, so that can be a major challenge if you're trying to do an exam at home and you maybe don't get along with your housemates. How do you ask them, or how do you tell them and say, oh, do you know, I'm actually sitting this and I really kind of would benefit from some quiet? Or, you know, things happen as well. In fact, it happened to a colleague of ours this morning where she slept through her alarm and then couldn't make it to a staff meeting. So, you know, these things do happen. Are there some, you know, Christian, do you have some helpful tips if we kind of flick onto the boosters section? Are there any of these that stand out for you, and any things that, you know, you've had to do to pivot or to adapt you know, things that you might have faced coming up to an exam around organisation?
Yeah, for sure. So we mentioned, learning how to get a bit better at organization and developing it like a skill. And, that block of feeling like, oh, I'm not really that good at organization. I'm not really that good at planning. Looking at tip 2, sort of stop, breathe, consider what are the minimum steps I can take. If you get into a space where, I suppose it readily comes to your mind, it helps you to think proactively. Like take the idea of a plan. If you write things out a few days out of what you personally need to have with you or what you need to have completed, so, to facilitate your exam experience, that little bit of effort now saves so much grief later. And I think, you avoid that trap of putting things off to later. I think that's a huge problem. It's so easy to be like, I'll do this, I'm a bit tired today. I'll do this a little bit later on tonight before the exam, or I'll wake up tomorrow morning, an hour out of the exam, and I'll do it then. I know it's hard and it can be really struggle when you first start doing it, but trying to force yourself to do the thing now, saying, what is the hardest thing that I have to do now? Let's get that out of the way, have that done and dusted, because if you do that, everything else, relatively speaking, seems really easy by comparison. You take away those sources of stress, it just doesn't seem to bother you as much anymore. At least I find personally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there's a question that's come in on Facebook about how kind of routines can help with focus. And I think it really relates to what you're saying, because if we think of our minds as kind of like a big shopping bag that's got lots and lots of different stuff in it. And so, an exam is kind of trying to go into that bag and extract the piece of information that, is relevant to what we're doing. Now, obviously, there are things that we think about or things that we worry about all the time, but there are also things that we can do that can help to then not have to worry, like knowing that we've got a backup plan, or knowing that, if our internet fails, we can do this, or knowing that we've set 2 alarms so that if one, fails, then we've got another one to help wake us up. And so if we do all of those things, it's a little bit like taking some of those items out of the bag, so that it then makes it easier for us to focus in on the bit of information that we require. So we don't need to have big elaborate routines. We just need a couple of really simple things around looking after ourselves, and maybe some simple techniques that we'll go on to kind of later on around panic. But yeah, I think that can be useful. So I don't know if you 3 want to make any comments about routines and focus, or if that kind of covers it.
Yeah, I think routine is actually such an important thing to, for day-to-day life and sort of getting through things. I cannot remember for the life of me who said it now, but someone I was reading online or on a book, I can't remember, but he was basically saying the idea of, discipline it kind of equals freedom, in the sense that the more you have well-defined habits, in a sense, it sounds kind of counterproductive, but the more you free yourself up to do the things that are more important to you, it takes, like you said, Nicola, it's taking those things out of that bag, and sort of gives you, more freedom to sort of focus on the things that are more important and really matter.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on to the final topic, the one that, lots of people get concerned about, the panic kind of topic. So exams, as you both know, probably as all 4 of us know, cause people stress, and sometimes we can find ourselves panicking either in the days leading up, or we can find ourselves panicking actually on the day of the exam, immediately before it starts. Finding things that work for you is a little bit of trial and error, so there's no kind of one size fits all, and it's about practicing some kind of techniques or some tips in the lead up to the exam, so that you've got a couple of, you hear people talk about toolkits, so you've got a couple of tools in your toolkit. If we can get on top of anxiety as well, then it can kind of stop us getting into an anxiety spiral, which is where we can really start to panic. Caitlin, have you used any of the tips that are outlined here, or have you had success with kind of any other tips that you might want to share around reducing panic?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny actually, because the number 4 is a really big one for me. And I know that obviously students this particular semester are having exams at home. But I have found one of the best things is that, just particularly just in reference to number 4, is that if you are focused on the exam and you're doing too much review, especially the night before, you're not getting a good enough sleep, your mind doesn't actually take in that information along on top of that panic. And so sometimes I've found, and I've not even just found, but I've utilized nearly every exam, is not the focus of sitting at the exam table or sitting, I suppose now for students this particular semester, sitting in their space where they're doing their exam, but actually finishing the exam by using some of the tips that we've all just discussed over the last 20 minutes. You know, those tips, you know, will, if you have those in place and you have this well structured, and I suppose this comes on to being a bit timed as well, because if you can be well timed and well organized, then like things, for instance, like, you know, what I did and what I still do is I write a night before sort of checklist, even if it's just minute by minute. And that was when obviously the exams were at, you know, Wayville, when I was doing my undergrad. You know, because you can run into stuff like traffic or time delays. And so that's not necessarily so much. I think technology is more going to be the issue, like what we've discussed this particular semester with the predicament we're in. But I still think that writing like a to-do list the night before is great, because I will literally write it from like get up, tick off, done, you know. So I've got one done. You know, get up, have a shower, you know, breathe. And I try my best to have my review notes there, but like just like briefly overlook them, you know what I mean? Like, because I find that what people seem to do towards the end of the cramming, I suppose, which is something that we have to do, but if we can cram in a way where we're not overloading our brains with too much information, because that can happen. Sometimes there's only so much information a human brain, and from a psychological point of view, can really take in. And so, you know, get a good sleep hygiene, especially the night before an exam. Do not stay up to like 3 cramming, you know what I mean? And like, it is the worst, you know. Have a good sleep, have some really dot point notes, have a minute by minute diary in the morning that you can tick off. You know,
yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
these are the things that I've found that sort of, you know, help me sort of, as I said, sort of like, if you can relieve that panic, then you've got more functioning ability, cognitively wise, to be using that in your exam, rather than sitting there freaking out about whether you can do the exam or not. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
So I suppose similarly with the other 3 sections that we've gone through, again, knowing kind of the tips that help doesn't mean that we necessarily put them into practice. So, you know, here are some common blocks, some common things that will get in the way, you know, the pressure of time, or I forget because I'm panicking. Yes. If we flick onto the boosters section, again, Caitlin, are there kind of thoughts that you've got around these boosters, or things that you might have thought yourself or tried yourself that have really been effective?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I forget because I'm panicking, just like what you said, it's huge, you know what I mean? And that can be reduced by just some of the simple things that we've just talked about, just by being organized, just understanding the subject matter, the content, you know, understanding maybe where to start, like in regards to, you know, your exam. As I said before, maybe looking at the sections that might be, you know, have more points, maybe looking at parts of the exam that you understand a little bit better and starting there. Finding what works for you, and particularly, I suppose, with this semester and where we are now, with relying so much on technology with our exams, not necessarily sitting in this huge exam room. You know, I think routine's more important than ever. It might sound strange, but I think Christian made a great point. Like, you can't view your space if you're studying and having an exam from home as your relaxation space. You know, you need to understand that is your exam space right now for this time. And so I find that if you can just do that and just get a good sleep, do not cram to 3, do not push so much information in your brain that you just start forgetting it all. You know, that within itself does relieve panic. And I would say probably the best thing for me is just, you know, probably the OCD checklist that I have, where, you know, I love just checking listings off. So even just writing a checklist, I'll write, the first thing is writing a checklist, and I tick it off, and I'm like, sweet, I've done one thing on my checklist, which is writing it.
It helps to feel like there's progress, absolutely. And I think, I mean, one of the third booster down, this idea of, you know, the way that we talk to ourselves being kind of like carrot and stick. So we very habitually and very easily talk to ourselves in quite a harsh and kind of critical manner a lot of the time. Definitely. And so especially if you're cramming the night before, you know, you can have thoughts like, oh, why can't you get this? And I bet everybody else understands this. And those kind of really difficult thoughts. And we think that those thoughts motivate us. And sometimes they motivate us a little bit, but carrot thoughts motivate us too. And things like, you know, acknowledging that we've really, you know, we've put in the best effort that we can this semester. Sometimes topics are just really difficult. Sometimes it is difficult to concentrate and focus. It's been a really full-on semester for lots of different reasons. And actually, if we can develop a nicer way of kind of interacting with ourselves and talking to ourselves in a bit of a kinder or more self-compassionate way, we'll get the same outcome, but we won't kind of feel really bad when we get to the end. We'll be like, I did my best, I tried my best, I put some tips into practice. And so it doesn't come to us naturally, but it's definitely something kind of like organization that we can learn how to do differently.
Yeah, to relieve panic and anxiety so you can focus better. That's ultimately what you're wanting, really. So
yeah. Because if you're panicking, it's not that there's something wrong with you, it's that you're doing something that's challenging and something that's unfamiliar. And that's awesome. That's great, you know. So trying to remember that when we're actually under the pump is difficult, but
it's natural. Every student's going to have panic when it comes to exam. It's about reducing those anxieties that come along with it so that you can actually perform at your maximum level on that day. So yeah, that's my panic section. I don't panic section, I think.
So I think once again we have timed our discussion today really well. You've all given some great tips, and I think that the students out there will find some of those really useful. So to wrap up, Christian and Caitlin, who have been there or are there right now studying for exams, do you have any final words of wisdom for our students who are listening out there that they can take with them over the next few weeks?
You take it away, Christian, because I know that you're the one that are doing exams at the moment. So I'm interested to hear, you know, about how this is going to be for you students in undergrad. Yeah.
Thank you. I suppose the biggest thing to remember, and I feel to take away from this, is that remember this is only a short period of time. It's a really, really short period of time. You know, I know it's a few weeks where, you know, you're under so much pressure and you've got so much going on, so much to think about. You know, there's also life things that we have to worry about. But remember, eventually this ends. And, you know, like I also can't help popping in another little thing, but Nicola and Caitlin, I was really glad to hear about, you know, the cramming thing and that sort of like sticking carrot. When I heard that, it was like music to my ears. So if everyone's listening, take that on board.
Go and Google sticking carrot.
That's great. And Caitlin, any quick last minute thoughts, or do you feel you've
look, I just think I've always said, and I just always think, you know, stress and panic and all of that in regards to exam is normal, and especially this semester because there's so much unknown. So I just think that you know, students that are taking exams this semester especially, just be extra sensitive, supportive, loving to yourself, you know what I mean? Understand that you're under different circumstances. It's stressful as enough. So just take that extra bit of care to just be just more loving to yourself and understand that you just got to do the best that you can. And, you know, that's really all we ask for, I think, as university students, as I suppose as tutors, and as a university, as a community, really. So that's what I would say, yeah.
Great. Thanks everyone for all of your contributions and your thoughts, and thanks everyone who joined us. Good luck to all you students out there for the next 2 weeks of exams, and then your break after that as well.
And check out the Wellbeing Hub also for more kind of information on exam prep. Check out the Student Wellbeing Instagram page, all these lovely ways of us reaching out and There you go.
There we
Oh, well prepared, well prepared.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day and good luck to all you students.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks.
Good
Bye,
luck.
Nicola. Bye,
Bye.
Chris.
Bye.
Have a great one.
Bye.
See ya.